Good morning and welcome to TAO's second member resiliency conversation. This time it's with the Port of Portland and Curtis Robinhold. I'm Skip Newberry, CEO and President of TAO, and we're excited to be hosting our largest virtual event to date. A couple of rules of engagement before we start. All participants have been muted, so please remain on mute unless a TAO staff member unmutes you and calls on you to talk. You may ask or respond to a question in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to TAO admin, or Carisno. We will ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen where you have the option to vote yes or no, raise your hand, or offer applause for our speaker. We'll monitor the chat box in response throughout the discussion. Please engage with us on social media during this call and throughout the day. We appreciate all the support. Fun selfies with me or Curtis in the background are welcome. Curtis may be switching his background throughout this. I don't know, I guess he's got a reputation on Zoom now. We also want to just mention that due to the large number of folks who are going to be on this call, that we're going to capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered ones to Mobilize, which is our online community engagement platform. Mobilize is something we've been really pushing the last few weeks, and it's got a lot of traction. We'll post unanswered questions from our members there, which means that that's where you'll see the answers too. Mobilize allows us to keep the conversation going after the event. And if you have any questions about joining Mobilize, please reach out to Justin Martinez, whose email is on the screen. And Mobilize is also for members only. So if you have any questions about joining TAO to access this new member benefit, please reach out to membership@techoregon.org. TAO staff support is provided by Carisno and Justin Martinez. You can feel free to reach out to them with any questions or feedback. Kara will be the timekeeper and giving us the 5-minute warning. Also, a huge thank you to Packstar and the leadership of their CEO, Peggy Miller, who's underwriting this series, so we really appreciate her support. Please join us next week as we continue our resiliency series, where we'll have Catherine Helms, the Chief Data Officer for the state of Oregon. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Curtis Robinhold. So as Executive Director, Curtis oversees daily operations at 14 sites in the region, and prior to his role at the Port, he was Chief of Staff for Governor John Kitzhaber and CEO at RM Energy and held senior roles at BP. So Curtis, we're excited to have you here. I'll get right into the questions. When most people think of the Port, they usually think of PDX, the airport. So I'm wondering, what else is included in the Port's operations?
Yeah, thanks, Skip. Really honored to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. So the port is it's been around for 130 years, originally created to dredge the Columbia River, but now people know us for PDX. We're really three big business lines. I brought a slide to show a bit of the expanse here. If we could go to the next slide, you'll see a view of all of our assets in the Portland area. And what you see is really 3 airports. PDX, of course, the largest. We own 2 general aviation airports as well in Hillsborough and Troutdale. We have 4 marine terminals on the Willamette and Columbia River, and we're the largest developer and owner of industrial property in the state of Oregon. So it's a pretty broad expanse. It's changed a lot recently. About 30, call it 40 years ago, 75% of what we did was the marine business, cargo coming into Portland, leaving raw logs bound for Asia, for example. That was about 75% of our business, but now we're 75% at the airport. And that's just about especially the growth of aviation in the last 40 years and the gradual decline of marine in the Columbia River, just the struggle of getting up the river and the scale of markets that we compete with has really changed that market. So a lot different than we used to be.
Great. So I'm wondering, like, you know, as we think about what's really kind of spiking right now during the COVID crisis, there's still a lot of goods being shipped. So I'm imagining marine is probably pretty busy. Do you see that momentum continuing as we come out of the crisis too?
Yeah, you know, I think people have seen the numbers on the aviation side. It's devastating. You know, we had about 800 passengers yesterday at PDX, which is mind-blowing for an airport that usually has 50 or 60,000 passengers a day. Being down at 800 or 900 is depressing. But we have seen sort of continued growth in the marine business and in air cargo. So both of those businesses are doing well. Especially recently, about a year ago, we got weekly container shipping back out at Terminal 6. Folks might have heard about the sort of dispute around labor that had been keeping service away for about 4 years, but that business is doing really well. So we've got a lot of export cargo leaving on containers for Korea, Japan, China. Last week, we got 80 import containers from China, which is actually just an indication that value chain is still robust. I know it's going to be challenged here in the months ahead, but it is one, let's say, limited bright spot for us is that marine business. And we'll see, we also have an auto import and export business. We export Fords bound for Asia. We import Hyundais and Hondas and Toyotas. And those businesses are really starting to see declines, mostly because that value chain has been falling apart, both on the U.S. side and in Asia.
One question that I got from someone that I was talking to actually yesterday was related to some of the shipments to Asia. Like, is there any effort underway to collaborate more with some of the other marine terminals and ports up and down the Northwest and along the Columbia too, for that matter?
Yeah, the Asia-bound cargo has not been impaired. Our longshoremen are showing up every day. There was a little bit of, I'd say, a bumpy start as coronavirus started to spread. There were a few cases and threatened cases along the West Coast. We're in pretty regular contact with the big ports. The biggest on the West Coast by far is LA Long Beach. They're struggling a bit, mostly with constraints around the types of containers they've got. But for the most part, the marine terminals on the West Coast are functioning. There have been sort of limited threats due to a longshoreman or two getting the coronavirus, and then you have to essentially drop that crew. They've all got to go into quarantine, and you got to start over and clean the facilities and that sort of thing. But for the most part, we've seen pretty good coordination on the West Coast and not a lot of restrictions on movement of cargo. And this is maybe a bit of a sideline, but especially here in the metro area, trucks are moving faster than they've moved in 20 years. It's mind blowing. You and I were talking about taking our kids out for bike rides. This is one of the reasons that we at the port have talked about congestion pricing as being a real strong tool to regulate and help encourage fast movement of freight in the region.
That's a good point. Shifting to PDX for a second. So when do you anticipate existing flights or routes will come back online coming out of this?
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough to know. And, we're in pretty close contact with the airlines. It's hard to run an airport without airlines. So we're really interested to see how they're thinking this through. But, we've seen probably 70 to 80% of routes curtailed. So we're parking a whole bunch of Alaska's planes out on our runways right now. We have a small, it's called the crosswind runway, that's holding about 20 Alaska planes just because they can't use them. And the ones that they are using are about 10% full. So it's really a question of when people begin to have confidence again in air travel. And we just don't know what that looks like. Our team has been talking about this middle seat test. When would you be willing to get back on a plane and sit in the middle seat? And that is really a health question, and it's testing and tracking. It's less about will the flights be available than it is the demand there for those flights. So, I'd say we will likely see a gradual increase in the summer. There's clearly this threat out there of a double dip and what that looks like. We're nervous about it as well. Just financially, it's pretty rough as well for us. We got some CARES Act funding. We got about $73 million at PDX. That buys us probably 6 or maybe even 8 months of runway, pun not intended, to really get business back. And, honestly, our hope is that we see that happen here in the next 3 or 4 months, a gradual increase. If we can just start seeing that there's light at the end of the tunnel, we can plan around what a return looks like. That's really up to the airlines, and that's driven by passengers.
Mm-hmm. So do you see, let's say that this crisis continues for a little bit of time, or there's a resurgence at some point in the next 18 months, like looking beyond 18 months, do you see there being much of an impact for planned future routes that were likely to come online, more direct routes, for example?
Yeah, it's a really good question. At the heart of it, we've got a pretty aggressive team that pitches Portland. We work closely with both private sector and public sector on sort of making the market more attractive to airlines. That being said, it again is really market driven. We were just this morning on my phone got your flight is ready to depart for Portland. You're leaving Tokyo. I was supposed to be in Tokyo celebrating this essentially a launch of a Haneda flight into downtown Tokyo instead of the more out in the country version, which is Narita, the flight that we've had for almost 30 years. So that Tokyo and eventually a Seoul connection on Delta is pretty important. I suspect if we can recover that basic air travel mentality, we'll get back to a conversation around connecting to the rest of Asia through Seoul on a direct flight. London had been doing really well, and Amsterdam on the European side. Mexico City is a market that we think is attractive in the future, but we're just waiting for an airline to feel like they can make a successful go at it. So, I do think it's that question about how long is it going to take to get back? How long does this recovery last? And that's a lot of what we're thinking about now is how do you help get those big levers into place so that once the health issues are addressed, you can address the unemployment and economic growth questions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So in terms of like the traveler experience, I know you guys have been doing a lot of work in recent years around, making that as efficient as possible, as enjoyable as possible. What are some of the restrictions or changes that people might expect to see that are more safety related as a result of this crisis, whether it's like security or boarding? What might that look like?
In some ways, it's helpful to think of the port as the landlord out at PDX. We essentially can provide the facilities for whatever CBP, Customs Border Protection, or TSA, or local health authorities want. I'm sure many folks on the call have been through Hong Kong, for example, or Taipei, where you go through and you get a temperature screen when I think it's actually back from one of it might have been SARS where those were put in place. We have the capability to do that, but we can't operate that. So, I suspect there will be some protocols developed. We're talking with West Coast airports now about can we at least be unified in how we come back and what that looks like. It might be around spacing. We've heard discussions from airlines around removing every other row of seats until you get a recovery, essentially to provide some distancing. But, you sort of have to shake your head a little bit on, is an extra 3 feet going to get you a healthy experience? I just read this weekend, Emirates is doing in Dubai a blood test of all travelers, a 10-minute test, essentially to test for positive. That's something you can do in Dubai, but you probably wouldn't get away with in the United States. So, I suspect we'll see some changes here. We're all thinking about what the post-COVID world looks like. At the heart of it, I also expect that people will be doing more, maybe wearing masks on planes for a while, maybe bringing your wipes to wipe down your seat or whatever it is if you don't do that already, being more cautious and maybe more conscious of their own actions in travel. I know even out walking on the street this morning, right, people are kind of trying to avoid each other. You can imagine that will be, at least for a while, that will be part of air travel as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now, I know also that you guys have been really focused on this multi-billion-dollar construction initiative. So what impacts, if any, are there on that?
Yeah, it's been a huge deal for us. We've been thinking for 5 or 6 years about specific design and really got underway about a year and a half ago. We're calling it PDX Next. Essentially, the facilities we have are built for, the beginning of them were 1958. The center of the terminal today was built in 1958, and then 7 consecutive bits of construction in the ensuing years. We're flying about 20 million passengers a year, at least we were last year, and we're really trying to get to something that's much more, around 35 million. So we call that, I think if you could go to the next slide, I brought a bit of a diagram here on what we're talking about. Folks have seen it for the last year or so, and you see these capital projects. It's about a $2 billion improvement. The kind of blue-green boxes are really about parking additions, and quick turnaround is a rental car facility, essentially to speed that process and keep cars at the airport. The one that's been underway for the last year and a half is that as you're entering the airport on the right-hand side, the E-Concourse extension, that's scheduled to actually complete in June. Might be a little bit delayed, but honestly, we're doing our best to keep our construction trades working. We think that's one thing that we can do as long as we're doing that in a COVID sensitive way, trying to keep folks working at the airport. The big ones are there on the left, Terminal Core and Concourse A and B, a $1.6 billion project to really get the facility ready, both for more passengers and for a different type of experience. Be a lot more digital, more handling of your own bags, trying to essentially create flexibility for whatever that looks like in the future. And that work is underway. We're actually doing the demo on A right now. I think folks have probably experienced going out to the end of C back when you were still traveling to get your Alaska Horizon flights. It's a pretty exciting project. We're doing our best to keep that going here through the COVID issues, and we'll see how that runs. But if you went to the next slide, gives you a sense of timeline here. You'll see it really runs us out for the next 5 years. That Concourse E extension I mentioned later this year. Next year, a new Concourse B. I still think we're going to be on time with that. That will be essentially a new base for the Horizon, the smaller commuter flights. And Alaska, which is about 45% of our volume, will have most of the south side of the airport at that stage. You'll see then ground transportation, we're trying to make that flow more and create more possibilities for parking close in. And then the big kahuna is really this Terminal Core change, new main terminal. I think one last slide, if you would, the next slide, is just a rendering. ZGF is doing this work for us. This is one of the first seen publicly. This is entering from the roadway. You're looking at where ticketing, there used to be a wall, and then back there, an Oregon market. This would be much more flow. You see Oregon wood on the ceiling, much more light. And essentially what we're enabling is moving pieces around to fit with whatever that technology choices are going forward. So super excited about it. I'm hopeful that we'll keep these projects alive, if not just slightly delayed. It's pretty exciting part of the Oregon's future, I think, and of the region's kind of community furniture, if you will. It really is supposed to keep that feel that is special about PDX, but also enable people like you and I and people on this line that travel a lot to get through quickly and have good choices available.
That's great. I mean, that's an amazing rendering. It's exciting. So a couple questions we got from some folks in the chat channel. So one is, what plans does the port have to integrate or merge with the ports of Astoria or Clatskanie?
Yeah, none really. You know, those are really marine ports. There are actually 23 public ports in the state of Oregon. There are brother and sister ports, if you will. They essentially historically have focused on fishing and logging as primary cargoes. We've been asked in the past, would we be interested in sort of collaborating and even helping to operate? And to be honest, there isn't a whole lot of upside in us doing that. And for the most part, those local communities aren't interested in having the Port of Portland run their facilities. So at least for the time being, I suspect there won't be a whole lot more than there is today. You know, as I mentioned, you know, our marine traffic has gone down over the last 30 or 40 years. Many of these smaller ports that really have delivered historically really great service to these smaller communities are struggling. And is a really good question around, you know, how do you get a cost basis that fits the local community and is sustainable? It's something we're super interested in, but that's really driven by the local ports. If they want to talk to us about help, we're certainly happy to engage, but for the most part, we try to keep those lines clear.
Yep. Yeah, and another question, you mentioned the expansion to the airport. I'm wondering if there's also, or this person is actually wondering if there's also plans underway to expand any of the industrial sites?
You know, 20 years ago, we were really engaged in acquiring these large lot industrial properties. We did that really successfully. You saw on that map, both in Troutdale and Gresham. We've got some decent sized properties out in Hillsborough, but for the most part, we have developed those properties. And you know, I think especially in a recession, folks start looking around saying, where are the big manufacturers going to go? We have shifted our focus in large part because of the lack of these large lot industrial properties, to really smaller manufacturing. Where can you get a piece of property that's 7 or 8 acres instead of 100 or 120, and get more high value jobs in those spots? So it's not that we weren't happy to create, for example, the Amazon facility out in Troutdale is on our former property. They've got a couple thousand jobs out there, but for the most part, those are picker jobs. They're lower income earning jobs. It was really important to get out there at the time, but increasingly we're focused on where do you get higher value, higher wage jobs using the property base that we do have.
Sounds good. So a couple other questions. One was, are you looking to any other airports for best practices, whether in responding to COVID-19 or more generally? And someone else notes, I'm not sure if they have this context as well, but I think your former boss is involved with the Denver airport. And they're like, hey, the Denver airport has a mini golf course right outside of where security is. So that's something you should definitely consider as part of this remodel. Throw the mini golf course in there too.
Well, yeah, so there are kind of two questions there. One on COVID and response. We're in pretty close contact with other airports. I mentioned especially on the West Coast, but broadly, we call them gateway airports, the internationally connected airports. There are about 40 of them in the US. We're in very close contact around who's doing what and how do you react, and how do you align with the federal government, which has a very strong overlay on airports, rightly so. I do have questions myself around post 9/11. A lot of practices were instituted to help restore confidence in air travel. I think we'll be talking about more of those things here in the next few months. Even that temperature screen I mentioned earlier in our conversation might be just an interesting way to reassure people that we're doing our best and we're trying. So, it's a good question. Bill Wyatt, my predecessor, is actually at Salt Lake City. They are also just finishing up a $3.5 billion construction project. I don't know that we're going to make room for mini golf, but I like the ideas. We do try to look around and see what we can do to stay close to the community. Our vendor choices or our concessionaires, we try to get local restaurants. I'm really excited about E because Tillamook is going to be in there, and Bambuza. The guys who open the bars on the west side, the Lightning Beer Collaborative are doing essentially an aviation themed bar called Juliet right at the end with a view of Mount Hood. So we do try to keep that special feel. I don't know about mini golf though. I'll pass on that.
So here's perhaps a more serious question. So PDX has been a leader in the past around trying out new technology to improve the traveler experience. And this question is about, is there going to be continued work, even in light of the crisis, to accommodate people with disabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we have spent a lot of time in the design process thinking about equity overlays. How do you make sure that the airport is not just great for folks who are accustomed to traveling and traveling quickly, but also for people who are constrained in sight, for example, but also having other disabilities. So we've worked with our architect, ZGF. We actually created a special team, brought community members in to help us, actually representatives of the disability community, to help us see what we couldn't see otherwise, to try to get that view in place about how can you make sure this is a place that's welcoming and efficient for everyone. I'm really proud of that work. Our team has really tried and grateful, honestly, to the community for helping us with it. It is really that effort to say, this is not just for some small slice of the population, this is for everyone. And how do you make it a more welcoming space that also considers these threats and challenges for other people? So it's been, honestly, for me, a great learning experience. It's an overlay we're trying to put into different parts of our business around equity. Who's at the table, who's not at the table, what voices need to be heard before we enter this next phase. So it's been a great experience, really proud of it.
That's great. So we're at about the 5-minute mark, just so you know. We've got time for a couple other questions here.
Great.
So one of the questions was, as a landlord, are you seeing many requests from your commercial or industrial tenants as it relates to abatements or other types of concessions, and how are you all dealing with that?
Yeah, we're certainly hearing a lot of it in the airport itself, from the airlines, from our tenants, concessionaires, for example, from rental car companies. And one of the big challenges for us in the airport is, it's a challenge, but also it's just simply the framework, is FAA is very strong in its regulatory framework of how you operate the airport. So for the most part, we are not forgiving rent that's due at the airport, but we are changing payment terms to enable our partners to have more time, both a delay in how soon those payments are due, but also a payment plan at the back end for when they can come back in. For the most part, our industrial property has been sold historically, and for the most part, I'd say our industrial property is not experiencing the same downturn yet. So we have not had requests on that side as far as I know, nor do I expect that will come into play, in part because of the model that for a long time was essentially selling our industrial property, getting it ready for market and bringing it to market. Whereas at the airport, we really are a landlord in that relationship.
Mm-hmm. And this is another question that kind of follows from that role of the port as sort of a big economic engine in the region. And this one specifically is around, folks who are maybe more marginalized or looking for economic opportunity in the region. And there's going to be a lot of folks in that boat after this crisis. So what ways might the port, through its role as an economic catalyst, help some of those folks get access to economic opportunity coming out of this?
Yeah, that's great. It's a really good question. We spend a lot of time talking about the airport, but one of the more interesting pieces is really this property development engagement in the community. And that is in large part because we're restricted on how we spend airport money. So this other chunk of business is one that's really important to us and interesting. I mentioned we've changed our model around industrial property. We also have a very strong mentor protege program that if folks want to get in touch with me, I'd welcome making that connection. Kimberly Sutton, who runs that program, is really about helping local businesses get engaged in the contracting world. And we've been recognized widely for that work, especially disadvantaged communities getting into, for example, construction work. I think using those levers around our core business is really where we're strongest. And it's one, obviously there's going to be a lot coming here. I think we're going to have a long recovery, and I'm really interested in a lot of these levers around how you help those folks who are at the most dire end of this recession get back in the game. And I think we'll all be talking about it for some time.
Excellent. So we've been asking all of our featured guests the same somewhat lighthearted question, which is, in this new virtual world in which we find ourselves, what's your most sort of awkward or embarrassing experience so far?
Well, I mentioned to you that now you get to see my backgrounds for those of you who are on visually. I was having a little lunchtime chat with a buddy of mine, Mike Golub at the Timbers, and he showed me that his background was the sauna. And so then we sort of got into a little bit. And, I include things like, for my kids, I've got a Sesame Street background, and a friend sent me, because I'm a Springsteen fan, a Bruce concert. But sadly, I forgot to turn off the background when I got on a statewide call with business leaders. And so I came on, and it looked like I was sitting in the sauna. I just needed to put it on. But there you go. I think that's the worst of it. I actually have I've really enjoyed some parts of this. It's been I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, and my kids are really happy to have me home more than they've had me before. It's been really challenging, and I know a lot of people have different challenges in the sort of work from home, but I've actually gotten a lot out of it despite the pain and suffering.
That's great. I think a lot of people are feeling the same way, looking for a little bit of a silver lining in all this.
Yeah.
So I want to say thank you, Curtis. We're at our time. Really appreciate your time spent with us. We know you're really busy. And thank you all who joined us on the phone. For those of you where we didn't get to the questions, we'll throw those into the Mobilize channel, and we can engage there. And Curtis, what we'll do is we'll just follow up with you and your team and see if there are specific ones we might be able to get answers to that we can just throw into the channel. But we really appreciate it, and thank you again to Packstar and Peggy Miller for her support, and we'll hopefully see many of you next week for our next one with Catherine from the state of Oregon. Thanks, everyone.
Skip.